welcome back to Beyond Evolution, where we help you navigate AI's impact on humanity. I'm Jess, your co host, here with Mario, and our mission at Beyond Evolution is to help you reclaim your agency and thrive in a tech driven world so we can make the most of what AI can offer without losing sight of what truly makes us human. Today, we're joined by someone building a bridge between cutting edge AI and communities that are often left out of the conversation. We have Wendy Gonzalez here, CEO of Sama. Under her leadership, Sama provides human-in-the-loop services that power some of the world's largest AI systems while ensuring dignified, fairly paid work for people in East Africa and beyond. Welcome, Wendy. We're so happy to have you here.
Thanks. I'm delighted to be here.
Awesome. So before we hop into learning more about Wendy and Sama and all that she does with AI, we will go into our mindful moment led by Mario.
Thank you, Jess. Wendy, thanks again so much for your time. This is kind of the fun, quirky little bit that we like to do to be a little bit different, and also just really it's kind of our gift to you, our guest, and to ourselves to just really connect to each other as human beings in amidst all the crazy chaos of life and all the change that we're going through as a global community. Hope you enjoy it. I'll just kind of lead us into a 2-minute or so meditation and then bring us back out and we'll be ready to go. So we always start with a few deep breaths, kind of at your own pace. Just kind of get settled in your chair first and move, wiggle, stretch, whatever you need to do, just to kind of like let whatever go from the day. I know you just had a crazy San Francisco rush hour drive home. So whatever you need to release, as you take your breaths on every out breath, you can kind of just let that all go and fully arrive here. So when you're ready, you can take a deep breath in through your nose and hold at the top for just a second and release through your mouth. Again, a little bit deeper this time. Hold and release through the mouth. Just letting it all go, whatever you brought here that you don't need. And we'll do one more. Hold for a little longer. And just let it all go. And as you allow your eyes to close and allow yourself to relax a little bit deeper, wherever you are, just come to the realization that all of the busy chatter and all the change is not really who we are and our true nature as human beings. Of course, our true nature is to just be calm and present, aware, compassionate, and connected to ourselves and one another. So as you allow your breath to just go at its own pace, in and out through your nose, just settle in deeper and deeper into that space, into this space together. We'll be here for just a couple minutes. Of course, if you are driving, feel free to skip ahead 2.5 minutes or so. And when we're ready, I will bring us out. Okay. As we begin to return, you can give another little stretch. Open your eyes at your own pace. Maybe one more deep breath, clearing of the throat. And whenever we're ready, we can jump in.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much, Mario. All right, let's hop into the conversation with Wendy. So Wendy, again, thanks for being here. We would love to start at the beginning. So kind of what drew you into the tech space as a whole? Would love to hear your story and what led you to where you are now as a CEO of an organization like Sama.
So I started my career in technology by realizing what I didn't like to do. So I actually started my career in accounting. I graduated with an accounting and information systems degree, and I realized in the first couple of months that I absolutely hated auditing. So that was my entree. I transitioned into management consulting at the firm Ernst & Young, where I was at, and I really got drawn into leveraging technology to help transform business process, organizations, helping companies really leverage technology to empower their organizations. And so I carried that forward. I then went to a couple of public companies, working in technology leadership positions to kind of carry that forward. And then I caught the startup bug. I co-founded a SaaS startup, and that was really fun because I wanted to continue to work with smaller and smaller companies and have more impact. But as we were kind of getting into that space, a few things happened. I ended up having a few small children and started to really spend a lot of our time thinking about what are we doing that's contributing. Basically, we've got these little people, we're trying to walk the walk and model behavior, and like it's awesome building infrastructure systems for like intelligent lighting and sprinklers, but it felt like something, so there was something more, right, to do. So we started thinking pretty seriously about how can we combine, kind of passion for technology and basically social impact. And then what happened was my father passed away unexpectedly, and it kind of was a like, what are you waiting for sort of moment. So I started to look into a bunch of different areas where I thought I could contribute. So everything from supporting grassroots, systems to build, to create, access for grassroots politicians to make a difference in their communities, to meeting the founder of Sama, Laila Jana. So I met her and got to know the organization, and basically instantly fell in love. In fact, I don't think she could have not hired me, because I probably would have just persisted and stalked and walked around until it happened. But this notion that, that work can be a force, and basically companies can be a force for social good, was really powerful. I grew up as, a daughter of immigrants. My husband's a zero-generation immigrant, first person in his family to ever go to college. And so we know that work can be, a game changer. It's afforded us, the opportunities that we have. So this idea of a company that the whole goal was to provide financial independence and agency, and this notion that give work, not aid, because ultimately what everybody really wants is not necessarily a mosquito net or a well. They would love to build their own wells and do what they see fit. So this idea that work could be that connection was super powerful, and it resonated a ton, because that was kind of our situation. It's like, we know that it comes with a lot of hard work, but it also comes with luck and access. And if you don't have that access, it's really, really difficult. And so there are so many incredibly bright and talented individuals out there who have a lot of barriers to employment simply because of where they grew up, or their gender, or, not having sort of access and even network. So Sama was really, really spoke to me a ton. And Sama means equal in Sanskrit. So, we really view this as leveling the playing field, right? People are super smart, I view this as opening up the door so that people can walk through it. And so I was really passionate about this idea that business can be a force for social good. You can have purposeful employment models that you can treat, employees with dignity and respect, and, basically create sustainable pathways for people out of underserved communities.
Amazing. Yeah. I want to touch on a couple points here, but I think the first one is, it's really amazing, kind of taking a big turning point in your life and, turning it into something where you want to help out with. So, really looking at, what am I doing with my career? And then pivoting in a way where you're actually making an impact into people's lives that, are benefiting them for the better. So I think that's very inspiring to hear about. Talking about Sama a little bit more, I think it's amazing, the message behind it. And I actually didn't know that Sama meant equal in Sanskrit. So I think that's a great kind of symbolism of, what you guys do at the company. Can you tell us a little bit more about Sama and tell us a little bit more about, how it kind of creates that equality, and I guess what the mission is with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, the whole company was built on this idea that talent is distributed equally, but opportunity is not. So what we have is a purposeful hiring model. So most people, they hire on the basis of, okay, you've done this job before, or you've got a degree from this university. Well, what ends up happening if you're in a situation where you can't afford to go to university? You don't have those network connections that will get you into a position. So what we do is we hire on the basis of impact. So the ability to come and join our training and join into a job where everybody starts with equal pay. That was also something that was very important too, between genders. But we hire on the basis of household income. If you're below the World Bank poverty line, right? Un and underemployment, and basically, areas are potentially where you live, basically, because again, you could have, theoretically zero income, but be in a wealthy area, you just never have had a job, right? And so we took these factors in to create an impact score, and anybody who passed that impact score gets to come into training. We have a digital skills training program that teaches about everything from AI, but also computer skills. And the idea is, if you can basically not only provide the training, because there are a lot of companies that and NGOs and nonprofits that do training, but the real hard thing is getting a job. So this was the idea, is not only are we going to provide the training and the access and not hire you on the basis of impact, that purposeful hiring model, but we're going to give you a job, because jobs beget jobs. That's the idea. You build your first CV, you get that first job experience in a professional environment. And that is what drives the sustainable lift out of poverty, is you not only have the CV or the resume and the experience, but you've built the skills. And so this idea of leveraging technology to support work was huge, because those are ultimately the skills of the future. So that's really the thesis behind this. The why we do it is to create that sustainable pathway out of poverty. The method is create job skills and future-proof skills. And the idea, now I'm going even to the next evolution of this, was you build these skills, then it's a great thing if somebody moves on and moves to a different company. Like that's fantastic. We move up the organization and to build skills. And from there, you do enough of that, all that money is staying in a region, right? Which is fantastic, and you start to build an ecosystem. So we're super proud of the fact that there are many people who are alumni of our company who've gone on to build their own companies and hire other people. So that was kind of the idea, is to bring giving work full circle. And that was the kind of the slogan was give work, not aid, because that's what's really key. And yeah, that's that was the genesis behind it. The other thing too that we did up front when we were talking about Sama meaning being equal in Sanskrit is that we wanted to hire at least 50% women. So the challenge is it's really difficult to get a job as a young person, even if you have a degree, let alone don't have a degree because you couldn't afford it. But women face a ton of barriers to employment. So by starting with that goal of, okay, we're going to hire at least 50% women, was also really important, because when women succeed, they contribute back to, there's just a lot of data, right, that says that money goes back into education, paying for school fees, and the community. So that was kind of the idea. I'm definitely proud to say that we are at 53% of women from the entry level all the way up to the top.
Amazing. I love to hear about, a woman-led organization and a woman, majority. And I think what really kind of stuck out to me, and a quote that I resonate with, is, teach a man, I'm going to butcher this quote, give a man a fish and he's fed for one day. Teach a man to fish and he's fed for a lifetime. And I think that kind of goes along with, the organization, Sama's organization of, create sustainable skills, and you want them to develop these skills and, spread their wings and continue to grow from there. And that's kind of what you guys are helping with, is to create those skills, or to have them develop those skills. Can you talk, I guess, more about the skills that you help people develop?
Yeah. So when we started this, the idea was, digital work is a good thing to do. One is, there were, fiber rings that were now connecting all of Africa, a couple of large fiber rings. So internet access really became available in the, I want to say the 2011, 2012 or so. And so it might be 2010. Anyhow, the idea that was that digital work was a great way to do it, because if there were lots of jobs that were available in region or locally, well, then sure, people would be doing them. But that was the challenge, is majority of where we were hiring is primarily informal economy. Right. And so the idea was, hey, we're trying to create these formal economy jobs that have a safety net. They're salaried. And in the informal economy, if you get sick, you don't get paid. It's like, it's going to be, working day labor as an example, selling snacks, having, selling secondhand clothes. Like that's a pretty common set of occupations. But if you're sick, you don't earn. And so this idea that you can create, formal economy jobs, just regular kind of like 9 to 5 type job, right, with benefits, medical, etc. Not only does it create a safety net to build and learn and grow, but you can also do things like incentivize for quality and performance. So anyhow, with this idea of how we started hiring, we did not initially come in with this idea of, okay, hey, you need to be able to program software. It's like, well, no, because we're trying to do this hiring model. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on human judgment. And so we started doing work initially, everything from like transcribing business cards, things like that, back before there was OCR technology. And ultimately, as I joined in 2015, one of the things that became really clear is that human judgment is incredibly important in AI. right? And you need it to be able to drive the appropriate, not only sort of evaluate and confirm that the model's working properly, but you need it to train the models as well. So it became a natural shift, and we started to focus our attention, all of our attention and energy, initially on computer vision projects. So everything from autonomous vehicles, to, virtual fitting rooms and things of that nature. So it was a very natural fit. So it's a long way of getting to your question of, well, what are the skills you're building? Well, ultimately, these are how to take unstructured data, structure it, create validated data sets, find insights from that data. And so we also felt that, hey, AI is a thing. That sounds kind of silly now, but way back when, 11, 12, 13 plus years ago, we saw that there was going to be a really significant need here. So it absolutely fit into our future of work and future skill sets approach.
Very cool. Amazing. So everyone at the company kind of looks at, maybe not everyone at the company, but the majority of it is looking at data, trying to interpret it or trying to clean it and then interpret it and use it for what types of things?
So it's we do a lot of work in retail and like consumer packaged goods. So the virtual fitting room, or product catalogs, search relevance, things of that nature. So we help train these models with data sets. We also support companies who are building models and they need those outputs to be validated. So for example, you've built a search model for products, and you need to actually validate that that the model, when you put in a prompt or a search, is actually responding back with the appropriate response. And by appropriate response, it means like, was it correct? To have the right tone, things of that nature.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really important because I see a lot of companies nowadays trying to implement AI projects and AI solutions, but are they actually being correct? Are they actually giving the right output? And it seems like, you guys help out with actually validating that if it is correct or not.
Yeah, that's primarily it. Is that how do you make sure that the models are performing as they are expected? One thing that's really, really critical is when you build a model, you have to actually evaluate it too. You have to understand, what does good look like? And that is one of the things that is most critical, regardless of the model you're using, ChatGPT version X, or Llama Y, whatever it might be, because there's always going to be a new model that's coming forward. You need to know, but what do you want that model to do? When does it perform, well? What is right? What is incorrect? And if you don't have those evaluation criteria, how do you make sure it stays on track? Because models are just like humans. They learn with experience. They learn with data. And you need to constantly come back and check and say, okay, hey, it was actually working. Because if you don't, you have a number of things that could happen. Certainly bias is a significant challenge, for instance. There are models are so much better now, but, like infamous examples of like the, Amazon recruitment engine that was, built to automatically select engineers, and the sample set of women were so small that it determined that women weren't qualified, right? So that's an egregious example of inference that can happen. But beyond that, models do drift and hallucinate. So if you don't have that approach, and you don't think about, well, when is the model working versus not, it becomes pretty difficult to maintain that sort of level of quality and accuracy. That's effectively what we do, is provide the human insight to support model evaluation and model training.
Very cool. Awesome.
Amazing. So yeah, I love that you guys focus on hiring on the basis of impact. And I'm curious just to understand more, maybe this is just how my brain works, but kind of zooming out a little bit on Sama, just so that I guess I understand and our listeners understand. You work with AI and you provide human insight to build valid models, and you primarily work in retail customer packaged goods. Is that correct? And is your hiring the main way that you show up with impact? I know you guys are doing a lot of work in East Africa. So I'm curious, what percentages of the pie of Sama are what we've talked about so far, and what else do you guys do for impact? Are you a nonprofit, for profit? What's your primary driver of focus for the organization as far as impact?
So, our primary impact is the social impact. So if you think of it in terms of ESG, right? So we're in the middle, social impact, which is creating livelihoods and providing living wages and employment to people in underserved communities. And through this purposeful hiring model, we hold ourselves accountable to living wages. We have we're part of the Living Wage Coalition. We have, a methodology to make sure that basically when we say living wages, it's going to be, enough to support, safe and sustainable housing, right? Local cost of living, local, food costs, 10% savings, access to medical care, things of that nature. And then also, pay equity, benefits, right? So it's very common, and it's actually uncommon to have medical benefits in the region, like even for regular, just kind of corporations. So to be able to do, you know, medical, dental, vision, mental health, paternity leave, maternity leave, the pension plans, and the equivalent of like a 401k, all that is. So it's a broader set, right? That we look to provide support in, because I think that creates, like, that's the benefit, is you have the full safety net. But then we also have carbon goals. So we're part of the science-based actions. So we have a 2030 goal for carbon neutrality. We're already carbon neutral in 2 of our offices. The only reason we're not yet in East Africa is because of the reporting mechanisms that the utilities have there. But yeah, those are our goals. We started as a nonprofit. To be able to do this work, though, you have to have technology. You also have to have sales teams who, sell this work, right, to companies. And so we made a transition to for-profit, but then it became a benefit corporation. So we are certified B Corp, which is, an excellent global standard for companies with profit and purpose. Abide by the UN SDGs. We're a UN Global Compact, signatory, things of that nature. So we hold ourselves accountable to both our, basically our business performance goals as well as impact goals.
Amazing. How was that transition from nonprofit to for-profit?
That was a pretty interesting one. So we kind of did like almost like a belt and suspenders approach, if you will. So what we did was we actually had it was our nonprofit, right? Nonprofits are owned by the state, basically, or the company technically belongs to the, the state of California, effectively, right? And so what we did is, when we made that transition, the nonprofit basically had owned the company. And then as we invited investors in, of course, the ownership or the equity gets diluted. So there's the nonprofit, there is a portion for employees, and then there are the investors. To date, after multiple rounds of funding, the nonprofit is by far the largest majority shareholder. So why that's really important is that we wanted to make sure that, from a governance standpoint, the foundation or the nonprofit had a seat at the table. So it does. There's a nonprofit representative on the board, which is very cool. That the nonprofit is aligned with the company and the investors, right? Because you want to have an alignment of goals and outcomes. And if the company does well, the primary beneficiary is the nonprofit. And the nonprofit's mission is to create other businesses that give work. So that was always the intention of the nonprofit, is to fund other business ideas in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's something that we've done on a small basis, giving business grants away to other social or impact entrepreneurs. But that's I'm proud of the way that we set it up, because, again, like, the biggest beneficiary of a good outcome or the company being successful is the nonprofit, which then funds many more future Samas, basically.
Right. And I commend you for that, because I know it's not easy. It's the harder road, I feel like, to kind of have the nonprofit and the for-profit kind of intermingle in a legal way that is, it's a lot more work and paperwork. So I commend you for that.
Yeah, I know it is. Yeah, going through the transition was it was an interesting transition. It sounds like you know all about that. But yeah, when we went through our conversion, it was quite a bit of, or it's non-traditional, right? Usually when somebody founds a company, right, they get all the equity. Well, that was not the situation, right? The foundation is being taken care of, but that was kind of always the intent. And I joined, and this is my first, nonprofit or, kind of impact based company, but I really joined with this, aspiration and goal that we set forth, that said, like, hey, the more successful we can make this business, it's a proof point, right? It's a proof point that social businesses can be super successful, and that even though there are some aspects of it that are, like, well, harder, living wages. Okay, when inflation goes up 15%, in some of these areas, are you gonna be able to charge your customers 15% more? No, right? So, I mean, that'd be great. That's not usually the way that it works in terms of negotiation. The point being is, that means that we've, like, got to be the best. We've got to be super efficient. We've got to have great technology. We've got to have, stellar processes and performance, because at the end of the day, nobody selects, supplier or partner as they're like, oh, how nice, you've got a mission too. It's because you're helping them solve a mission critical business problem. You're delivering something great. And then, the mission's like the cherry on the sundae. It's like, oh, okay, well, I can feel good about, putting some dollars here. It was a really interesting challenge because if you can, it does take, to your point, a discipline. You've got things that are that I was going to say are non-traditional, I guess, when you only have a single purpose, for profit. But boy, if we can do it well, like, wow, you're creating lots of lots of goodness, but you're also delivering great business value. I kind of look at it like green technology, right? What a great thing to invest in. It really is good for business, right? To be energy efficient. It's good for the earth, but it's good business too. And that's really how we look at it, is we look at it as intertwined, right? We have this model, we've got these great dedicated employees, many of which have been through the company for years. Some of our management directors are former annotators. Right? So you can build this great, strong business. People can have the benefit of it, and the products are great, right? That's the entire idea.
Right. Well, I feel like with my nerdy entrepreneurial brain, we could spend hours talking about Sama and how it's set up and everything. But I think I'm curious more to talk about at this point, like what you're doing in East Africa. Is that different than what you're doing here in the States? And are you doing that just through the nonprofit or the for-profit?
Well, so we are for profit, and really the nonprofit is basically the largest shareholder basically in the company. So it's one entity, but it's a board that has representation of the nonprofit, so that we're governed effectively. And then also as a public benefit corp, right, there's the governance there to be able to raise social, to be able to have two purposes and to be able to raise impact related issues of governance. So it's a good structure to have, right? It provides, I think, some good controls in place. Almost our entire workforce is in East Africa. 90% of the company is there. That's where all the structuring of the data sets go. We have all of our annotators. The question you asked earlier about like, well, what percentage of the company is impact? Well, like 90% of the employees are impact associates. The
Wow.
annotators in East Africa. And then that's where most of our operations are. Our management teams. So as I mentioned, some of the, annotators turned managers, directors, right? So there's a whole, operational infrastructure. We have engineers in, East Africa, HR people, finance people. And then in, the US, Canada, Costa Rica, Europe, sales people, sub-management are, our technology teams, but also we have engineers in East Africa as well. So, yeah, it's where the majority of the team is.
How many people do you employ? Like you said, 90%. How many people is that out there?
So there are about 3,000 people in the team. And so the team outside of East Africa is what would probably look like a regular small startup, like, 90 people, 80 people, but that's inclusive of, sales and engineering and go-to-market people. I think.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So the vast majority of the team is in East Africa.
Right. Yeah, that's beautiful. You're really making a difference, it sounds like. Jess, do you have anything to add to any of that? I feel like we're maybe ready to move on to the next section if you feel like you're ready.
Yeah, no, I think it's just interesting to learn about Sama a little bit more and like the logistics behind it. And I'm also pretty business minded as well. Don't really know a lot about nonprofit, for profit, different types of organizations. So that's definitely a little bit new to me, but yeah, it's very interesting to learn about. So thank you for sharing. Yeah, we can hop into the next section. So let's talk more about like policy. So we talk a lot about on this show, responsible AI and AI for good, because we want to make sure AI really benefits humanity. So in your opinion, Wendy, what does responsible AI look like worldwide in terms of policy, rules, access, oversight? What's your kind of opinion on that?
Yeah, it's certainly a really interesting environment, especially now. I think in the U.S. and of course, there's the EU AI Responsibility Act that passed overwhelmingly. What I think, I'll start maybe with what I think it is and sort of how it's best adopted, and then share a few thoughts on policy. To me, responsible AI, it's a development framework. Right. So it is a best practice way to develop AI that is, accurate, effective, transparent, trusted, right? And it makes a lot of sense because if you're building a product, you want it to be adopted. And you want people will adopt your product if it's trustworthy. And they certainly wouldn't introduce it into really important parts of their life unless, there was some level of trust. So I think this notion of responsibility, like, why wouldn't it, it's not like a a dirty word. It's like it's a really good thing, right? It's the way that AI should be developed. And at the end of the day, the awareness of it is really important because it's developers who build this, right? Or who vibe code it, right? At the end of the day, those are the people that are really starting with this, which is why I think of it as a development framework. So the education is really, really important part of it. And the pillars, which I think in many respects, kind of transitioning a little bit here to the policy side, the pillars, from the EU Responsibility Act, they are the right pillars. Like, you can take a look at the best practice frameworks of, you need to have data governance and provenance, right? Did you build your model on the right data? Is it over or underfitted, meaning biased or potentially non-representative data? Do you have the right to use that data? Interesting, what's happening now? Like, because there's a lot of there's a lot of litigation around that space right now. But do you have the right data? Do you have a way to? Is this your data private, secure? Do you have a way to validate or evaluate your model, which I think is critical? And then do you have human insight, right? And how do you apply those things based off of the, kind of degree of risk, right, associated with the application? So on the policy side, the challenge with, I think, the EU AI Act is that there's always this balance of innovation and compliance. And sort of whenever, hopefully what I'm saying is not offensive, but like whenever was the government like on the very bleeding edge of a particular technology or thing, they're not necessarily the subject matter expert. So I think this concept of administration and compliance is pretty it's a bit heavy handed. And I think what's happened, unfortunately, is that now, companies are backing away and they're saying, what, we're just not going to comply, or we're just not going to do business in Europe. And I think it was built with this intention, a really, smart intention of, hey, we want to protect our citizens, we want to build trustworthy AI. It's like, if it passes our standard, it's like certified organic, Rotten Tomatoes, right? Like certified fresh. The challenge is those things were so stringent, it actually put too much onto the companies. And unfortunately, then you've got some of the companies that are the biggest in the world building the foundation models that so many other AI models are going to be built from that aren't participating, right? And that's a challenge. So how do you make it less stick and more carrot? And I've seen some pretty interesting things out there, including a California bill that was being presented where they wanted to create it as more of a carrot than a stick. So how do you incentivize developers to get certified on responsible AI frameworks? And in exchange for that, you get indemnity, right? Meaning if something happens to AI, like you're protected, you can't get litigated against, as an example. Well, that's a carrot, right? This is saying, hey, we want to recognize people who build in the right way. And I think there's a place for finding that. There are going to be some things that, we are going to need compliance for. It's kind of like security and data privacy. Like if you design a system build it, and then you say, oh, actually, I got to make it secure, you're hosed, right? Like you're done. You can't do it after the fact. So this notion of education, awareness, and putting these principles out there, I think are the most important thing. And you don't want to scare everybody away with, well, now we're going to slow you down. But having these practices and these guardrails are really important for performing AI. And what I both try to communicate and share as well is that, it's measured twice, cut once. Like you do this and you do this right, you're actually going to be delivering a better product. You're going to save more money over time. It's not just about, rushing to cut corners. Because what will happen is that even if you go and do that without kind of thinking through frameworks like, how do I evaluate this model? How am I going to know when it's, going off the rails or it's doing the right things? And it doesn't have to be just like mortgage applications and bias against certain, people of color or something like that. It could be just like literally, I'm an autonomous vehicle and I didn't annotate enough of the little limes, the little scooters on the road. Well, it'd be really problematic if you had a deficit in your data set and it doesn't now recognize scooters, right? That would be a real problem. So it's really about, do you have representative data? Does that data in that universe and how you've thought about it, the data is going to constantly change, but you've got a framework you can go back to, right? And say, okay, yeah, how do I evaluate it? It's working. How do I make sure my model's not drifting? So super long-winded answer, but I do feel strongly that responsible AI is a incredibly important framework. It's going to create not only better, kind of safer and more trustworthy AI, it's going to lead to better adoption. I think companies are taking stock of that. We're working with a couple of companies, for example, have our gigantic, global search engines as an example that they recognize that wow, we have got this great model, but you go to certain parts of Southeast Asia, or you go to we wrote a paper on Swahili. If you benchmark the top four LLMs, and you use Swahili words, and ask for dishes, for example, native to native to Kenya, it's going to get them wrong like 8 out of 10 times. So having that evaluation criteria, saying, oh, okay, hey, when it comes to these types of searches, this is the kind of relevant data we want to get. All that becomes really important and helps developers and people building these models figure out ways to make the models better, more accurate, more performant.
Definitely. Yeah, I guess a couple points to touch on. I think frameworks are just like super important. I think for anything that you're learning, if you want to do it properly, you want to follow the correct instructions, So I actually didn't know, you say it was the EU responsibility framework? Is that like
yeah, there's the EU AI Act, which has like a bunch of pillars on it. There are a couple of different organizations. There's the Partnership for AI, which we've given some support of them in some of their responsible AI frameworks. There's like AI 2030. There's a few of these organizations. There's no standard, right? Like, so there's no global standard, like, kind of like a I don't know, I was going to say IEEE, but there isn't that out there yet. But there are frameworks, and they all have fairly similar elements to the pillars that I just mentioned. And then beyond that, the other idea is that how you build your models, the notion of things like ethical sourcing and an ethical supply chain are a component of it, right? So one of the things and the challenges is that, and this is a common challenge that sometimes happens with crowdsourcing, and it's not just generalist skills, but it's also the PhDs who train this model. People find ways to sort of game the system because you only get paid if you get the task right. I literally was talking to this is a couple of years ago, but to a neighbor, right? And I'm like, I was bored, so I just went on. I started doing some tasks. Well, I'm just going to keep clicking until the answer gets right, until I get the answer, the right answer. Then I keep repeating that. Well, does that because that's when you get paid, completing the activity. And so it's very easy to go onto one of these platforms and say, like, I actually did one of these just to test it out the other day. Answering a few questions right, I became an agricultural expert. I can assure you that I am not an agricultural expert. I do not have a green thumb. We just lost our whole, crop of peaches because it was, I overwatered it, right? No. But that's how you can sort of, that's how you can sort of trick these systems. So this idea that you can incentivize for quality, you can have the right time, processes to do things. And that's one of the things that we think is a benefit of our model is that, well, yeah, they're getting paid you're getting paid a salary, right? So it's not you can incentivize on quality, you can incentivize on, training, and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think incentives, when you talked about how, to get developers on training responsible AI, and then they're not responsible in the future if something were to happen. I think that's a kind of a good way to, I guess, ensure that these people are doing the correct or following the correct procedures to develop these correct models, So I think what we're doing and what's out there right now, I think we're on a good path forward, with these incentives, with that EU Responsibility Act, and, talking about the data and is it good? Is it private? Are we evaluating it? Do we have human insight into it? I think those are all good checks, to understand, is this model actually going to benefit the greater good of humanity? And then when you said before, humans want to be able to trust these models. So if it's not trustworthy, they're not going to allow them to, be used in their day-to-day lives or in their whatever they want to use them for. So yeah, I just think it's a good path that we're on, that we're trying to do things in the right way, or at least hopefully majority of the developers are trying to do that. So yeah.
I hope so. I'm optimistic, and I think that's where it starts. It's kind of like, and I think there's policy has a role to play. Like if you think about the electric car started to boom when there was a tax incentive, right? And then all of a sudden I was like, oh yeah, okay, I should get myself an electric car, and like, hey, that's great. Well, so I think that there is a role for policy, but that role for policy really should be on incentive instead of compliance. But in on compliance, it's kind of like becomes like taxes. Well, how do you find the loopholes, right? Or how do I just start a company in Bermuda or whatever, right? Like, and that's kind of what's happening to the some companies, bigger companies choosing not to operate in the EU because of that. So it's that kind of fine balance of, policy's got a really positive role to play, and sometimes, compliance is sort of the bare minimum, but I think it needs to be combined with some sort of incentive. And so I thought that was a pretty interesting kind of public-private partnership. It's like, hey, you can get the certified, fresh rating, and you can, have some benefit and value of that, but without all of the, you've got to go through these, 17-point checklists, and we can choose whether to approve your AI or not. Right. And that becomes a whole different kind of a thing. So it's good, but it's got to start with the companies and their interest in developing and responsible.
Definitely. Awesome. Another question, how do you see AI kind of reshaping the labor markets and, changing the workforce in East Africa, but also anywhere around the world in the next 5-10 years or so?
Yeah, it's definitely going to shift things, I think, fairly dramatically. And I mean, I don't want to all sound like, like a total uber futurist where it's going to be like Wall-E, we're all going to be sitting in the lounge chairs floating around on the Lido deck. I think there will be, lots of shifts certainly that happen over time. I mean, it's already changing the way that we work today. So the productivity, starting with productivity, I'm not sure that I know a CEO who isn't, or another executive or manager who, who's building a company that's asking themselves, wow, what can I do to, kind of create more capacity with these tools? The key though is that context is really important. So even if you have tools like code developers, not if you either of you like vibe code or have built your own, custom GPTs and things like that, like these tools are really incredible, but you need the context of what you're building. There is this awesome quote, so I can't take credit for it, but from another executive was like, hey, AI isn't a magic wand. It's really like holding up the mirror. And so do you have a business problem that you want to solve, right? Do you have the context around that, and can you leverage those tools effectively? So I think from just how we all work, it absolutely will shift the way that we all work, because it's kind of like, like Google Maps, right? I'm old enough to remember when we had Thomas guides, which are the paper maps, that you had in the car, and then you'd have to look it up and quadrant G4 and flip to the page. And now nobody obviously uses that. You use some sort of a navigation system like a Google Map. So it will absolutely be adopted. It will absolutely change the way that we work. And then the how will it change the workforce as well, and how does that affect East Africa? Well, my hope, and this is one of the reasons we're kind of really passionate about doing what we do, is that very similar to the how mobility impacted countries, right? India skipped landlines, basically went straight to mobile. Kenya is a very similar situation where it's a mobile and digital first population. There are going to be more working age people in sub-Saharan Africa than all of Europe in the next 5 years, 6 years. So it's really important that a workforce has these new skills and this new way of working. So I hope that it kind of like mobility becomes a leap forward, because it's going to be a part of the economy, whether anybody likes it or not. Having these skills to stay both relevant, informed, and hopefully be that leapfrog, kind of like mobility, I have high hopes for. And so we try to, kind of advise on where we can with the governments, the policymakers who will listen, that hey, think about frameworks, think about incentives, encourage innovation, but responsibly.
Are you essentially saying that you think there's going to be a large influx of supply of labor into the market?
I think that what'll happen is that there's going to be a lot more consumption, if that makes sense, right? So when the chips started getting smarter and smarter, right? Like the NVIDIA chips and things like that, the processing power just kept getting smarter and smarter. What did everybody do? Everybody didn't jump and say, oh my gosh, now they're getting smarter and they're getting cheaper, so therefore nobody's going to have any need for data centers. It's actually the opposite. Because they became more accessible, cheaper, and smarter, you can do more with less. Now listen, adoption is going through the roof, right? And that's why all those energy poverty is a whole nother thing that is an interesting topic to talk about for AI. I don't think it's talked about enough, but what happened was it was the opposite. Now everybody is doubling down on building infrastructure and getting access to energy to be able to build models more rapidly, quickly. So in terms of, we're going to see a bunch of, all of a sudden there are tons of people who are going to be sitting like Wall-E, right, on the Lido deck, and unable to walk anymore. I think that what's going to happen, at least in the next, several years, is that what's going to happen is the how we work will adjust. Our capacity is going to grow substantially. So our ability to do more, if you will, more with less or more with the same, is what's really going to shift. Could that affect the labor markets? Well, I mean, you can kind of see it, at least temporarily. It probably will for a bit. You can probably see with a lot of there's a lot of reductions that are happening in a lot of the technology companies that grew fast and were large. But I don't think that's going to be the case over time. Just the way we work is going to shift, probably bounce back. It'll be more about context. Like a good example of that, and if I'm going to into the weeds, just let me know. It's just to find this topic really interesting. So you're asking really great questions. It's like in engineering, you used to have to spend all this time trying to learn syntax, right? Like, do I know how to code Python as an example? Well, now these models like, Cursor and, Claude, etc., they make the syntax less important. But that doesn't make the context any less important, because what are you building? What are you trying to solve for? How do you know when it's working? That's like the model evaluation component. All those things are needed. And so even if you're leveraging a tool and you can commit more code and you can do it faster, you still have to have the context to do it properly. So that's how I think that kind of work is going to shift, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I didn't know if Mario was going to answer or respond to that, but
brought it right back to you. That was
yeah,
great.
yeah. No, I definitely to touch on that point, I think it's good to know about like the syntax versus like the context of things, because we learn certain skills in school, but now that AI is very prevalent and we're going to be using it day to day in certain things, it'll be able to provide different things. So we have to focus on what are we actually, looking for, like, and what are we trying to solve, as you said before. I think that will be really important. And that's, one thing we kind of touch on this podcast is like, what are the human skills that will be so important for us to harness and develop that will partner well with AI and technology? How do we kind of draw those out of people? So do you have, another question, do you have any like human skills that we could focus on that will benefit, the human population to work in harmony with technology?
I think one basic rule of thumb is that like a bad process automated is still a bad process. From years of doing like digital transformation in systems, it's like, oh, we're going to implement this thing and like all of a sudden everything's going to be solved. And it's like, well, actually, the real question is what are you trying to solve for? And do you have the right, kind of processes or requirements in place? So I think that for this all to work in harmony, and I've seen this from like different boards and investors are like, well, it's AI, so just do it, and like you can reduce costs by like 30%. It doesn't work. That's not the right way to sort of think about it. It is going to be, what are the problems that we're solving? On a very basic level, like what are the things we're doing that we could be spending our time doing something sort of more valuable. So looking at what is the problem you're trying to solve for, I think is absolutely huge, because the technology is not the solve, right? It's the opposite, the human ingenuity that is the context creation that's necessary. I think we're going to learn a lot over the course of the next few years. Like I'm genuinely asking myself this question sometimes. Like I have kids, they sometimes have classes where they've got to write an essay in classroom to make sure that nobody's like, using chat GPT or something. Well, I get that, because how do you know what good looks like or what that context is if you're just like, I'm just gonna push that button and it's just gonna pop out an answer and I'm gonna assume it's right. So that question of that context and sort of questioning and validating, I think, is going to be a really important skill set, because if you assume it's all true and don't do the fact check, if you will, that's going to be challenging. And we've seen that even in very like just in our own company in very practical ways, where you can automate a workflow where you can, like, it used to take hours to synthesize this data. Okay, great. And now you can upload the documents and do a side-by-side comparison. Well, you still have to check that it's right. But if you have a tool like one of these coding tools, a lot of folks who've implemented these, say like, hey, sure, it'll help like bug fixing and some of those types of activities, but it's actually a very powerful tool for more senior engineers, because they know the context and so they're able to leverage it, right? So anyhow, I didn't mean to go off on a tangent, but I think that context and validation is important, which kind of all comes down to, like, I think the human insight part of it is really, really important, regardless of the application, whether it's the data side of it, which is where our company works, whether you're an engineer looking at the outputs of the code, there's got to be some level of human validation. We're not all the way there yet, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. I think like humans need to understand, how to ask the right questions and how to kind of base that on what you're trying to solve. Instead of, in schools where we're taught to just provide an answer, we should be teaching children how to look at the whole story of things and ask the questions and try to investigate. So I think those are some key human skills, is like, how do we question and validate those answers and if they're correct or not.
Yeah, exactly. Like I grew up, I had to do like times tables, building like multiplication tables.
Just
That's
like
not really relevant right now.
I remember like trying to turn them in as fast as I could, and I like write the answer down while looking at the next one, and like kept moving over. And like, what did that really do for me? But
Exactly.
it's okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. Hopefully it changes in the future.
Well, Jess, if you're done with your section, I think that was a great segue to go into the looking ahead section, where Wendy you said something that, yeah, it's just a great segue. You said we're not there yet. And I have a question about, are there perfect AI systems out there that are, balanced, well integrated, ethical? Are there examples? Or how close or far are we from that? And what are the hurdles to getting there if we're not really there yet?
Oh, there's some things that AI does incredibly well. Perfect, but 99% accurate. There are definitely, if you've got a contained sort of problem you're trying to solve for, whether it is kind of traditional machine learning or agentic AI, if you've got a contained, defined problem, there are things that AI can do fantastically, right? Nearly flawlessly contained. When it comes to higher complexity, several different steps, decisions that need to be made, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, steps in the decision making process, it can be challenging. So it's the best success you've seen so far is in sort of targeted use cases or applications. But how far are we away from the singularity, if you will, and Skynet? For those who watch Terminator, I think we're some time away from true AGI. Eventually over time, to really understand human context, there needs to be not just sort of this general understanding of AI, but it needs to understand physics, right? Like meaning space, like context, and it's not just language. It's obviously visual or multiple modalities. The models are getting quite good, but what'll probably happen next is the models will get more and more intelligent. There'll be a smaller amount of kind of big models. People are going to be building smaller, more application and context specific models, and then it's going to move to processing and like edge devices, right? So your phone, so models that eventually can get to your phone, I think will be where things go. But yeah, do I see like a Skynet kind of happening in the next 10 years? No, there's so many infinite variations and combinations, and even just a simple example that is used. I mean, there's a reasons why like Waymo's an incredible company. They've done amazing things with like kind of perception, right? So their vehicles, their autonomous robotaxis are in so many different locations. Well, they're in those locations and they're released city by city because you need to know the city, the stop signs, the traffic signs. If you go to San Francisco, there are so many crazy, bus only, taxi only, walled off, areas, bicycle lanes, this and that. And so a lot of training had to go in so that those cars could drive in that location. And then they had to look at it and say, well, what happens when it's rainy? Like we had a huge rainstorm just a couple of days ago. What happens when it's sunny? What happens when you're at dusk, when there's the glare that hits your vehicle and makes it really hard to see? What happens when, pedestrians and other people harass the taxis? If you read about that, like people putting like cones on top of the crew's vehicles to make them stop. I think it was, I don't know, it was an Uber robo taxi that got pulled over because it did like an illegal U-turn. The cops didn't know what to do. They're like, I don't think we can give it a ticket. There's like nobody here.
Right.
But the point of this is that it's contained, right? They're looking at every single scenario. Well, imagine taking that same vehicle and putting that in the middle of China where there's like a 12-lane roundabout and, hail and snow or something like that. So there's so many different scenarios and contexts that I think it's going to be really quite some time, even with all of the incredible processing power, that you're going to get a general, like, it can do everything and sort of look, act, see, think like a human. But there will continue to be great advancements in specific targeted applications. Waymo is a perfect example of that, right? A fully autonomous, self-driving vehicle, but in this city, right? Now take that. Could you take a Waymo on a cross-country trip across like single lane roads and, rural areas and interurban areas. I think there's some time. Probably we'll eventually get there, certainly over time, but it will take quite some time.
Right. It sounds like you're saying that from a problem solving, efficiency, accuracy standpoint, there are some models that are pretty damn close to perfect. But what about ethics? We've talked a lot about like integrating ethics and balance and avoiding biases, etc., into creating the models. Like how are we doing there from that perspective? Do you think we're
Not that
getting it
great.
not good? Okay.
No. No, I mean, like, I'd love to see that everybody who's developing has these, like, clear kind of guardrails and, like, frameworks in place, and everybody's like, I'm certified and I'm doing it in this way. I don't think that's the case. I think adoption is happening, kind of so quickly that there is no kind of standard. And as we discussed, like, in this age of massive innovation and companies are trying to get there faster, right? Faster and faster. It's kind of like SOC 1 and SOC 2. Those compliance standards for companies that meet security, data privacy, financial compliance. Well, that's great, but not all engineers love that, because now you've got like 50 artifacts that you got to do when you're building. So everybody wants to move fast, and I think I think we're not. I definitely do not think we're there yet. I think there's good intentions. I think there's excellent resources and frameworks out there, but to that point, like, companies got to want to do it, right? To build these great products. And I don't think a mandate's going to work. It certainly won't work in this current environment, but sharing best practices, I think education awareness. Google did something pretty cool. They released a bunch of software. They've got the software called Checks, which basically provides all these developer tools to do things like red teaming, so you can actually try to test the boundaries of your model. I think there are some definitely very good things that are happening. To rephrase the answer to a different question in the same way, I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah. What is red teaming, just to clarify?
It's when you have a set of parameters that you're testing. You're trying to test what is acceptable or not acceptable to the model. So as an example, if you are, let's just say, I'll use a simple, one. If, let's say it's a resume checker, right? And you want to check for, universities or something like that. Like, let's just say that's one of the parameters. Then what you do is you test it. You try to. It's kind of like penetration testing, or security testing, where somebody tries to like hack into your system, if you will, to sort of see if they can expose any weaknesses in it. That's effectively what red teaming is.
Gotcha. Yeah, going back to what you said about ethics, it's like we've had a lot of guests on the show, a couple of which have been, helping the UN and helping different presidents of governments, and also helping organizations develop that structure like we talked about. And I think that's, we're so early in the process that I think we have a long way to go.
I'm probably not as qualified as those folks who are advising governments, but
you're closer than we are.
Certainly we have done some of our own policy advocacy for being transparent about wages, paying living wages, and having ways in which you can actually incentivize for things like quality. So that's what we know. So we share about that. But what I have seen work well, and I think there's a lot of interest in companies that are adopting AI is they're wanting to have their sort of center of excellence or approach for AI best practices. And I think there's a genuine interest in it. And when I held a workshop not too long ago, I'm like, hey, how do you implement responsible AI, and getting your different stakeholders to understand both the frameworks to incentivize for it, and even the most basic practices of, hey, what are you trying to get your model to do? How are you going to evaluate it? Where are you getting your data from? Have you thought about security? These things, like these best practices, have been really, really meaningful. So I do think that there's an interest, but we just need to get the word out.
Right. Well, I think we're currently in the process of doing that with sharing your knowledge and wisdom on the subject. So definitely appreciate you sharing that. What's your pulse on the actual level of inequality that AI is leading to in our society? Obviously, you're very focused on kind of, in increasing equality, but we've had some discussions and there's a lot of information out there that points to the opposite. So I'm curious what your take is on that.
Yeah, I think that from just from a general, it's going to create more inequality. Yeah, I'm definitely concerned about that. I think that if there's not more kind of focus on sort of I would say like adoption, if you will, and building skill sets that are relevant to it, you could have you know more people in trees economies fall behind. So in our discussion of that we've tried to promote is like, hey, get these skills now. Like you gotta, build STEM skills. You're gonna have to build these context skills. You need to, if I teach a couple times a year, for example, like the University of Nairobi, and what happens when you don't actually have lab equipment, right? To leverage computers to build your own models or otherwise, like that's really challenging. And so do I think there's more inequality? Yeah, I'm fearful that this is just one more thing that can create a divide unless governments, countries policymakers take action to invest in the infrastructure, right? Like we got to look at this as the long game. Otherwise, we're going to have, I think entire, economies that are going to, get better or get much worse, right? Or fall behind or fall further behind. So yeah, I'm definitely concerned about that.
Yeah, likewise. We've talked a lot about that on the show. And yeah, that's something kind of to be determined. And, that's something that we kind of hope to be a little bit of a beacon of hope to spread that message. We really need to invest in ethics and figure out, what we're doing, gain an awareness on what this is and the impacts that it might have, especially for inequality. So I appreciate you sharing that. I just have one last question, and then Jess, I'm sure you have a couple comments to add. I always love your reflections, very insightful. But I'm curious, we talked about earlier just for a second, like, is there anything that we have not brought up that you think is really important to our past, present, and future with AI? I know you mentioned energy. You could talk about that. Maybe that's number one, or maybe there's something else you have in mind that's really important for people to know.
Well, I think that I'll maybe just emphasize a couple of things because we've had a really good, we've covered a wide range of topics. I don't think energy consumption is talked about enough. I just, believe that actually is going to be more of the threat to existence than anything. And what's happening already, I mean, these models, they take massive amounts of processing power the more they're adopted, or, energy consumption, the more cloud computing, the more tokens that you need to process. Thinking about what that infrastructure means long term and longer term, I think is really important. It's not a topic discussed nearly enough. So just because there's I forget what it's called. But there's a mathematical, basically formula, right? So the more I was gonna say more, is it Moore's law? Anyways, the lower the more the lower the cost of these chips, the outpacing of the consumption of like cloud computing and energy is going to increase ultimately exponentially because it becomes easier to access, right? So you suddenly take a look at this and you're like, whoa, like the amount of consumption and thinking ahead of that for adoption is just not something people are thinking about. They're like, oh well, let me just buy 3 Mile Island, let me just go invest in this other but things like clean energy that start to become, I think, more important than ever. I think the other component of it is as well, too, just to emphasize, is that for AI to be used, both responsibly and ethically, you need to double check it. You need to know what you need to do, that sort of measure twice, cut once, and actually validate the outcome. There's some truth to the I think it was it a Harvard study or an MIT study that the question was like, is AI going to make us dumber? Well, this is if you hit the button, you walk away, right? So I think that's also an incredibly important point, is be mindful and purposeful in what you're using it for. Know what outcomes you want to expect and just check it. Then it can be it is. I mean, think about what can be done now, for example, in drug discovery, right? It's like incredible. So it's lots and lots and lots of good. And I wanted to touch on something actually that you also said at the beginning of this, Jess, that I also completely believe in deeply, is that AI for good is incredible. It's always amazing when you can find these applications that make life better, whether it is medical care. One fun example I like to share is that we helped the Vulcan. So Vulcan company, they have all sorts of different social causes that they focus on. One is conservation. So elephant poaching is a real challenge, right? Poachers going and killing elephants for their ivory. Well, it's really hard for rangers to cover millions of acres, right? There's so many rangers and they've got, millions and millions of acres. So they built a drone that had cameras on top that would basically fly around, cover much more ground. And so we helped annotate or train the model, tag and annotate elephant butts and tails and, cars and vehicles and things that would track both the animals, the elephants, but also poaching behavior, which is like, a fire or a vehicle out in the middle of nowhere. Well, now you've got this incredible technology that didn't cost a huge amount of money to make that basically then alerts the rangers to say, go to these coordinate points. There's something fishy happening here, right? There's something, some poaching behavior. What's a great example of like an incredible application for AI. So there's so much that can be done. That then kind of goes to the investments where investing in technology, investing in STEM and supporting whether it is nonprofits or other companies trying to solve big problems with AI is a huge and really positive thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important. You touched on a couple things, the kind of alerting the world to the energy crisis that could, come to fruition, and then also the potentially detrimental effects on our cognitive abilities, our mental health, etc. But that's not the only side of the coin. There's a lot of really incredibly beautiful things that are happening because of the development of AI. So I appreciate you bringing that up, and it's kind of our goal too, is to be real. Where are we at, but also let's focus on the positive and make the most of it.
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the episode then. Wendy, I think you gave a final reflection in that, but do you have anything else to add that you would want to share with our listeners about AI, about humanity?
Yeah, human insight. It's all about human insight, human context, human validation. It's working for us, not the other way around. So yeah, no, I think I shared my reflections, and I just appreciate the really thoughtful questions that you
Yeah,
both asked.
absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today on Beyond Evolution. I think learning about your, history with technology and how you got to where you are right now with Sama, I think is really inspiring, and what you do with the organization with helping underdeveloped and underserved countries in East Africa have that equality and be able to use this data and give them that access to develop the data and create jobs and create like prosperity for them, I think is doing really good in the world. So thank you for all that you do with Sama and for all that you shared with us today on, your kind of opinion on where we're going with AI, what we can do to provide and to mesh and work best with AI, and what we can do on our human aspect and human side to develop ourselves so that, we create the best possible future for humanity. So again, thanks so much.
Thank you. And thank you for the meditation. That was actually pretty awesome.
Good to hear it.
Glad you enjoyed it, and definitely appreciate your grounded, calm energy that you bring, and just all that you do. Appreciate who you are. Keep going. Keep it up.
Awesome. And to always wrap up the podcast. So while this world of AI and what it means for humanity can be exciting yet uncertain, it's a journey of growth. So keep learning, keep evolving, but also allow yourself to just be. Thanks so much.